Okay, Year 11, this is the first of a series of videos that the English department are creating to help you prepare for your mocks and of course your GCSEs. In each video I will go through 3 or 4 quotations linked to a character or a theme. You will write notes using your worksheets, and then at the end of each video you'll write a response of at least 2 paragraphs to a question. In this video, the question will be, how does the character of Macbeth change throughout the play? The first quotation I wanted to go through with you is this one, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. Brave Macbeth unseamed him from the nave to the chops. And in terms of the place in the play, this is our first introduction to Macbeth in Act 1, Scene 2. And his character is kind of revealed to us through the voice of the captain. There's something almost like a tale being passed down through the ages, something of a Greek myth about him, or perhaps this kind of medieval folk tale portraying him in this kind of knight-like light. Now, with most of Shakespeare's plays, if a character is presented to us in such an idealised and romanticised light, we immediately expect that there will be some kind of downfall, and of course that is true in Macbeth's case. He's almost too perfect to begin with. The other thing to note about this scene in particular is that we're in at the end of or in the midst of a bloody battle, and the play itself is framed by bloody battles, perhaps revealing the kind of cyclical nature of violence. In the Bible, it teaches us that one tyrant begets another, and of course this was a predominantly Christian era of English history. So there is something somewhat biblical about the way in which the play is bookended by bloody violence. If the Bible teaches us that one tyrant begets another, it teaches us that violence only leads to more violence. And in terms of more kind of further context, this reveals to us that the violation of the divine order, or the violation of the natural order, if you want to call it that, will result in the world being kind of plunged into this inescapable chaos. We're talking about more than just personal corruption here. This is corruption of the entire world that surrounds us, and so Shakespeare is showing us the cataclysmic consequences of violating or going above our station, violating God's design. So I wanted to go through a kind of couple of or 3 methods using this quotation, so you have something to write about and analyse. The first thing to note is obviously, as I've said before, this phrase, brave Macbeth. This honourable adjective, brave, portrays Macbeth to be a kind of the epitome of masculinity. He's daring, he's noble, he's chivalrous, and it makes us realise really that Macbeth at the very beginning of the play is by design everything a man should aspire to be. The next verb that I wanted to analyse was the verb unseamed. And the word unseamed means in this case, means that he sliced MacDonald from the kind of navel to the jaw, so from the belly button to the jawbone. But of course, the word unseamed is also a textile verb, so it's a textile metaphor, and it shows us the ease and the skill with which Macbeth kind of executed MacDonald, portraying him as a very, very adept warrior. Again, provoking respect from the audience, perhaps, that he is doing God's duty. He's doing the king, what the king wanted him to do, and therefore enacting the will of God, as the king is representative of God himself. But further from that, this textile metaphor can be extended. He is essentially disrobing MacDonald. He's kind of almost taking off Macdonald's kind of gown of nobility, and revealing his kind of weakness, slicing him from the navel to the chops. You can almost imagine McDonald's being disrobed there. So it's a very humiliating end from McDonald. And it's also a little bit of kind of creates a sense of foreshadowing as well. It foreshadows Macbeth's undoing and his undignified end as well. He will, like similar to MacDonald, be disrobed. His kingship forcefully removed from him. The last word I wanted to go through was the noun knave, obviously meaning the navel or the belly button, which the Jacobeans thought was the kind of centre of the body. It's also perhaps a reference to the nave of the church, which is kind of the centre hall of a church, and perhaps suggests to us that this is a sanctified or justified killing. Like I said earlier, he is enacting the will of God, and therefore this means this act of violence from Macbeth is something that is fully justified, and that it is something that's almost divine in itself. So a very positive portrayal of Macbeth from the very offset, from the very start. Just after this quotation, or this instance, Duncan makes Macbeth Thane of Cawdor to replace his kind of treasonous predecessor who betrayed the king. And so we might excuse Macbeth in a way of being misled by fortune, if he feels that his bloodshed or the bloodshed of others makes Macbeth a very respected soldier. Then perhaps we can almost, but the lesson learned here is that bloodshed equals the realisation, sorry about my spelling error there, the realisation of Macbeth's aspirations. And so maybe the lesson he's learning from this is the more violence and the more bloodshed, the more likely I am to get to where I want to be. The second quotation I wanted to go through is this one from Act 2, Scene 2. Again, a very familiar quote, I'm sure. Is this a dagger which I see before me, the handle towards my hand? The place in the play here is Act 2, Scene 2. Okay, and it's the first glimpse that we have of Macbeth's powerful imagination. The dagger itself we could argue, is either an omen from the Three Witches or from fate itself, but is more likely a manifestation of Macbeth's kind of will and his desire, his murderous intention. The reason why this is such an important quotation is because Macbeth's own imagination is largely responsible for his downfall. The dagger is invisible to the audience. It comes from Macbeth. He is seeing it. And so it's his own murderous intention that leads to the act of killing. He may have been manipulated somewhat by the witches and by Lady Macbeth, but ultimately it's his own hand and his own mind that makes the decision to do it, to murder Duncan. So a few methods, as I said before. So the word dagger, obviously a very important symbol in the play. Like I said before, manifestation of his murderous intent, but also dagger is used for kind of close combat, highlighting the acts of betrayal. It's very deliberate. He is literally stabbing King Duncan under the guise of being this kind of helpful host, perhaps. Okay, and here he's not just betraying Duncan as his king, but also as his kinsman. Remember, Duncan is Macbeth's uncle. The dagger is also an ancient symbol of deception. So historically, it's always been linked to killing in close quarters under a disguise or under the cloak of deception. In Shakespeare's plays, Julius Caesar was murdered by Brutus with a dagger as well at close combat. The dagger here is also a stark contrast to the sword in Act 1. Okay, so when Macbeth was first introduced to us to unseam Macdonald from Nathan Chops using a sword, that's a very honourable killing, a very, like I said, knight-like kind of execution. But here there is a complete lack of honour associated with the murder of Duncan. And the last kind of symbolic, second from last symbolic kind of significance of the dagger is that historically it's used for ceremonial sacrifice, and in other cultures it's linked to the idea of ceremonial sacrifice, almost as if Macbeth is making an offering to the gods, or offering to the dark forces of the world through the murder of Duncan, in order to get what he wants, to realise his own ambitions. And then very lastly, I thought the dagger might be an interesting portrayal of man's fallen nature. Remember that in Christianity, we are taught that free will doesn't necessarily mean complete freedom. That if we don't allow God and the Bible to influence our decisions and our actions, then we are instead led by our fallen nature. So the dagger here may symbolize our fallen nature, man's kind of more corrupt desires. And in this case, in Macbeth, him being led by the dagger pointing towards the bedchamber, it does seem quite likely, or it does seem like a very, very real possibility that it could represent this, or at least we can interpret it that way, and that's fine as well. There's also a prolific use of kind of first-person personal pronouns, suggesting that this is a moment of personal crisis. This is a very pivotal moment of introspection where Macbeth hasn't completely decided yet to go ahead with the murder. And, he is making that decision. And later on, we'll talk about why that's important. But, there is something still somewhat sympathetic about this portrayal of Macbeth, going through this personal crisis and deliberating it's in his head. The question, is this a dagger, which I see before me, if you read the line itself, there's actually 11 syllables. Remember, every line every ideal line in a Shakespearean in Macbeth's speech is meant to be said in iambic pentameter, 10 syllables. So this is called a feminine ending, where there is an extra unstressed syllable. So before, for is an unstressed syllable, and me is also an unstressed syllable. It's a feminine ending, which is, again, not exactly portraying Macbeth in a very favourable light at this time. Jacobeans, female traits considered much weaker, and it suggests that it reflects his kind of uncertainty and his lack of resolve. Okay, something quite feminine about him, that he is easily swayed and manipulated, and certainly for us, it goes along with that argument that Macbeth is merely a puppet, easily manipulated, easily influenced, as he is done, as is true for the influence of the Three Witches and also Lady Macbeth on Macbeth. Lastly, the anatomical imagery here, my hand. Okay, you can almost imagine Macbeth's outstretched hand. So you have to imagine on stage that Macbeth would be kind of reaching out with his hand, and it suggests here that his outstretched hand was already grasping for power. So he's just using the dagger to excuse, and this hallucination to excuse and ambitious intentions that were already there, and murderous intentions that were already there. His hand was already outstretched. And we know that because he becomes Saint of Cawdor through his own doing, really. So later on in the play, because we have to think about these things structurally, Lady Macbeth rings, so later in the scene rather, Lady Macbeth rings the bell, and then Macbeth's kind of moment of deliberation, this soliloquy ends. So any last vestiges of kind of honourable traits in Macbeth die at the very end of this soliloquy because it's interrupted, and then he just decides to kind of go ahead with the murder. Now you might say that, you might kind of interpret this as though, well actually, you know, Macbeth is kind of instinctively a good man who is utilised as a puppet by Lady Macbeth. But I think it's more the case of he is influenced by Lady Macbeth, and that before he's even given the chance to kind of complete his own voice, complete his own thought, Lady Macbeth is there to kind of push him towards what she would like him to do. And that is in itself a lesson that Shakespeare is kind of imparting here, that actually if we don't kind of willfully or deliberately make those moral choices, the choices for good, then there are always going to be tempting voices in the world to help us make the wrong choices, and Macbeth falls victim to that. At the very end of, just before Lady Macbeth's bell rings, Macbeth himself says these words, "To gold breath gives." At the end of this soliloquy, he says that, basically stating that whatever he's saying at the moment are just empty words, and they're no match for the horror of the actual deed. So it seems as though he was going to kind of not go ahead with the murder of Duncan, but then Lady Macbeth interrupts that kind of thought. Okay, the third quotation is this one from Act 3, Scene 4. "I'm in blood, stepped in so far, that should I wade no more, returning were as tedious as go over." The place in the play here is the middle of the play after Macbeth becomes king. So it's in Act 3, Scene 4, the banquet scene, where he and his kind of men are having a celebratory banquet, celebrating his ascension to the throne. This quotation takes place just after the apparition of Banquo's ghost, after Macbeth's kind of quite extreme reaction to seeing the ghost. And we might interpret the ghost of Banquo as a manifestation of Macbeth's quite potent guilt. You know, it's so potent that we can now see his hallucination on stage. It's tangible, and the audience are able to kind of witness it as well as Macbeth. It's not just that invisible dagger anymore. Or we could also interpret Banquo's ghost as some kind of divine retribution or some kind of divine sign, perhaps a lesson to be that is imparted by the spiritual world to Macbeth. The lesson that there are more than just kind of personal consequences, that no death goes kind of unpunished, either physically, so no death goes unpunished in terms of the kind of physical repercussions on the person who committed the murder, or perhaps that there are very spiritual consequences as well. In this case, the extreme and the very powerful guilt that Macbeth kind of experiences. So perhaps Banquo's ghost is a lesson being imparted to Macbeth. But it's okay that the two, we can't distinguish between whether it's just Macbeth's own imagination, his guilt, or some kind of divine sign. That's okay. The ambiguity between the two, it perhaps is quite deliberate, because the Jacobeans perceive mental illness as a spiritual punishment anyway, so perhaps it was meant to be a bit confusing, and we're not really meant to make up our own mind between the two. So this image here, or what's actually happening here, is that Macbeth is deciding, rather than stop his bloody campaign. He's going to continue on. He says, "I'm in blood, stepped in so far, so I'm already this far gone. Returning is going to be just as kind of wearisome as kind of just continuing on." So he is making the decision to continue murdering and killing and executing people and assassinating people. So a few methods here. Blood, the historical symbol of guilt. In this case, obviously blood, we see it appear time and time again covering the hands of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. And throughout the play, it represents the emotion of guilt or perhaps remorse. There is a bit of a difference between guilt and remorse. Remorse is you did something that you kind of wish that you could take back, perhaps for self-serving purposes. Guilt is that you feel sorry for the emotional pain and the physical pain you've caused another. So, there's a whole debate to be had whether or not Macbeth feels remorse or real guilt. But also, blood appears very frequently in literature and media, and we often judge characters on their reactions to bloodshed. It's a substance that's very shocking to behold. We would judge a character as being very innocent if they were to perhaps faint at any bloodshed, which Lady Macbeth does do earlier on in the play. Or we could perceive them to be very wicked if they, were to react completely indifferently to blood, perhaps. And that is exactly what Macbeth does. His indifference and his reaction to this shocking substance of blood makes us realise that he is emotionally incapable of pity. He does not feel sorry for the lives that have been, or the people that have suffered as a result of his own hand. So that's quite an important thing to realise about Macbeth's reaction here. This phrase, "stepped in so far," we get this idea that Macbeth is almost kind of bathing in blood here. This liquid imagery reminds us of the rivers of blood, that biblical plague that God wrought on the Egyptians, and perhaps, again, reflects that idea of divine retribution. He's been punished by God himself here. But we can also go a little further with that. Tyranny, being a tyrant is a bit like the repercussions of it, the consequences of it are like a body of water. They kind of spool out of control, and they're difficult to measure. The lives lost, the emotional suffering, and for Macbeth here, the consequences are spooling out of control. Not only does he have guilt or remorse to contend with, he's also got the loss of his best friend, the disloyalty that is likely to ensue should any other people lose their lives as a result of Macbeth's reign. So everything's kind of spiralling out of control, just like this kind of river of blood that Macbeth finds himself in. It's just getting deeper and deeper, and it threatens to consume him entirely. It's threatening to kind of drown him in it. The verb wade is a verb of resistance. It means to struggle against, and it could represent the kind of conflict with Macbeth's moral conscience, so his internal conflict. But he chooses to ignore his moral compass, and I think that's what makes him truly immoral, is that he makes the choice now to ignore the lessons taught to him by his own kind of voice, his own internal voice. He knows that he shouldn't continue on. There's something that is resisting and pushing back against him, but he's wading through it. He's making the choice to continue on. And we see that complete disintegration of his moral compass as a result. And certainly just after this quotation at 14:2, the slaughter of Macduff's family makes us realise that Macbeth has refused to engage with the lessons implied by Banquo's reappearance. That actually you shouldn't carry on because there will be further kind of personal consequences, Macbeth has chosen to ignore that and be led instead by his pride and his fallen nature. And the last quotation is from Act 5, Scene 5. And it is this quotation. Let me just remove my paper. Oh, where am I? Okay. So, out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow, a poor player. Okay. And this quotation takes place in Act 5, Scene 5, where Macbeth is nearing the end of his life. And he's lamenting the futility of everything that he's kind of worked for, everything he's strived for. He realises here that kingship was actually he didn't achieve any power really, or control, or any glory. That's what he thought it would be when he first, strived for it, when he first murdered Duncan. But actually, in fact, it's been just a period of paranoia and isolation for Macbeth. So in this quotation, he's lamenting, that he was even fooled by the veneer of kingship, the kind of the facade of kingship, perhaps. And there is this kind of cruel irony about it. He committed the most wicked deception for the crown, but ultimately the crown is the thing that deceived him with empty promises. And there's something kind of, darkly humorous about that in a way. So in terms of methods, the brief candle here, this is a highly metaphorical quotation. The brief candle represents Macbeth's kind of very temporary, underwhelming reign. It was easily snuffed out. Or it could also represent any last semblance of kind of heavenly favour. So any last remnants of anything good within Macbeth that he once had is now he's snuffing out. He's choosing to snuff it out, because remember, after this he continues to fight, and he resolves himself to just fight until the very end, committing himself to kind of violence and fury. So that candle could symbolise either his reign or any last vestiges of anything good within Macbeth himself. The walking shadow metaphor here, suggesting that Macbeth is just this kind of empty shell. He's just a shadow of what he once was. He's devoid of any friends, any power, or any sense of fulfillment. He's just this mortal coil stalking the earth. Could also be a metaphor for that underwhelming kingship that we spoke about. It's just a shadow of what it promised to be, but perhaps this is also a metaphor for Macbeth's legacy. Now, every king wants to leave a legacy behind to be remembered in the history books, but for Macbeth, the only impression he's made upon the world is going to die with him, just like a shadow dies with you, or a shadow kind of is fleeting. It follows you forever. Macbeth's legacy will go to hell with him, really, and so that's perhaps what he is lamenting the most, that he won't even be remembered. So it was all for naught. There was no point in him becoming king in the first place. Last metaphor here, the poor player, meaning a pitiful actor, a reflection of Macbeth himself. He inhabited the role of king, but he did not truly belong to it. It reminds me of that quotation in Act 1, Scene 3, when Macbeth is greeted by the witches as Thane of Cawdor and then king. Macbeth says to them, "Why do you dress me in borrowed robes?" And actually that did come into fruition. He is just dressed in borrowed robes. He was never meant to be king. God did not choose him to be king. And so Macbeth realises that he really is just an actor on a stage, trying to inhabit this, trying to really belong to this role, but it's superficial. So after this quotation, Malcolm and Macduff storm the castle, and Macbeth is beheaded. It's a very humiliating ending for Macbeth, because his head is then paraded around the castle. and it's this kind of complete severance of the crown. So the gold crown, the crown that symbolises kingship, but also the crown of his head. It's a complete severance of those things from the rest of his body. And that's very humiliating, it's very undignified, okay? But also, this is kind of spiritually significant, because it means that his body would not be resurrected in its entirety on Judgment Day, you know, which occurs at the end of the world. It's the day that, according to Christianity, our bodies are resurrected and placed before God for judgment. Macbeth's kind of severed body would not be resurrected and would not be welcomed into heaven. And so we're not just talking about this complete severance from the crown, but we're talking about a complete severance from God's favour, a very fitting end for wicked Macbeth, perhaps. Okay, so those were the 4 quotations. Now what I would like you to do is to write a response to this question. How does the character of Macbeth change throughout the plays? You are going to write 2 paragraphs. Remember, okay, that you need to explain the significance of the quotations and the moment in the play you've chosen to analyse. You know, you need to tell your teacher what happens in that scene, why is it a pivotal moment. Don't just use the kind of typical PEA sentence starters without developing an explanation of why those are significant quotations. Use your notes, your place in the play notes to help you do that. You need to analyse methods, of course, at least 2 per method, 2 per quotation, and then you've got to link to context as well. And then afterwards, hand it in to your teacher to mark and write something that you are very proud of. You should spend about 30 minutes writing.